Throughout this podcast, we've talked a lot about human migration events that we are witnessing today. We've examined how displacement, poverty, persecution, and economic opportunity have all contributed to human movement throughout history. But what I want to address today is how the Earth's changing climate may act as another factor that drives human migration into and out of certain countries. And most importantly, how our slow response to climate change may put more than just those in developing countries at risk. So what will human migration look like in the future? What factors will drive the movement of the human race? And how will we address the growing need for humans to seek asylum for reasons other than persecution? We're spending the last episode of this series in the country in which I call home, New Zealand, to examine the effects of climate change on human migration and how the international community plans to address this new category of refugees. This is Motion, a podcast about migration in the 21st century. Whether or not climate change is a real thing is no longer a question I think we should be asking. According to the New Zealand government, there is an astounding amount of evidence that tells us that the average temperature of the world's atmosphere has been increasing over the past 150 years. This evidence includes a reduction in snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere, changes in the heat stored in the ocean, and changes in rainfall patterns resulting in more floods, droughts, and intense rain. Despite the vast amount of scientific evidence supporting this claim, efforts to address the effects of climate change and limit our contribution to the problem have remained relatively weak. Among my peers, while most of us agree that climate change is an important issue, we don't often think about it as an immediate threat. And the psychological response is a part of the reason why policymakers have made so little progress in encouraging us to change our behaviour. Things only get worse when you move up the chain of command. Climate change policy is not seen as a priority, and at worst, it's seen as a hindrance to country growth and development. Just last year, the United States pulled out of what was probably the most crucial piece of climate change-related policy in this decade.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
The scary thing is just how much of a threat climate change poses to our daily lives. According to the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, taken as a whole, the range of published evidence indicates that the net damage costs of climate change are likely to be significant and increase over time. Around 10% of the world's population live in low-elevation coastal zones, but in 80 years, sea levels may rise by as much as 3 feet, submerging inhabited islands and coastal areas. With this comes the increased risk of contaminated drinking water, interference with agriculture, and the disappearance of entire coastal communities. It's not just rising sea levels that pose a threat. Last year, wildfires tore through Southern California, forcing thousands of residents to evacuate from their homes. Hurricanes in Florida and Texas forced even more to flee. By 2500, the middle of this century, it's estimated that climate change is likely to displace between 150 and 300 million people. Quoting directly, if this group formed a country, it would be the 4th largest in the world, with a population nearly as large as that of the United States. But while climate change will affect nearly everyone on this planet, those in developing countries will likely be affected the most. Extreme weather events and tropical diseases can wreak havoc in these regions, with inadequate housing increasing the likelihood of displacement. The Pacific Islands are some of the most susceptible to the effects of climate change. Already, at least 8 low-lying islands in the Pacific Ocean have disappeared under rising seas. Thousands of people have already fled, including those from Tuvalu, which, because of poverty and proximity to sea, represent what Tom Baldwin, the environmental editor for The Independent, has called the ground zero of climate change. And this is where my home country of New Zealand comes in. In 2017, the New Zealand government announced it was considering a world first by creating a new category of visas to help relocate those in the Pacific Islands who had been displaced by climate change. One immigration specialist estimated that there were at least 3,000 people in New Zealand who, while officially classed as overstayers, could also lay claim to being climate refugees if these new rules were implemented. There is no standard definition for what a climate refugee is under international law. In fact, those fleeing climate change aren't even officially recognised as refugees, and as such aren't afforded any of the protections that come with this status. There doesn't even exist a global agreement on how to help the millions of people who have already been displaced by natural disasters. New Zealand doesn't have the cleanest track record when it comes to acknowledging this category of migrants. In 2017, two families from Tuvalu made the cases to New Zealand's Immigration and Protection Tribunal for refugee status. The families had fled their homes after experiencing a lack of access to clean and sanitary drinking water due to the effects of climate change.
Two families from Tuvalu who sought to be New Zealand's first climate change refugees have had their cases rejected. The Immigration and Protection Tribunal ruled they did not risk being persecuted under the Refugee Convention.
Ultimately, the families were forced to return to Tuvalu. Here's a paragraph I pulled from the UN dispatch. This kind of migration, climate change migration, is hard because it doesn't fit the traditional framework of migration. Migration is often viewed in terms of push and pull factors. Refugees, forced out of their homes by violence they have no control over, are pushed into other countries, while economic migrants are pulled into countries by the prospect of opportunities. But with environmental migration, it's difficult to say whether a person was pushed or pulled from their country. It's easy to say that lack of food security and disappearing lands push people from their homes, but neither one of these things are due to violent conflict or risk of persecution, the things asylum seekers must prove in their claim. At the same time, it's easy to conclude that dwindling opportunities due to environmental changes pulls people to other countries. But this lack of opportunity is not within their control and can often be the only means for their continued survival. A new concept has emerged amongst academics called survival migration. Originally coined by the scholar Alexander Betts, survival migration recognizes that people may have excellent reasons for fleeing, not just from persecution, but also from the effects of climate change, food insecurity, and state fragility. Despite this, we're still pretty far from reaching concrete policies regarding climate refugees. Solutions to climate change often are bounded by state borders and are limited by the concept of private property. But climate change does not observe borders, states, or boundary lines. Hurricanes destroy human settlements both in the United States and in the Philippines. Oceans strip fish life across the world, and rising sea levels will affect both countries that produce pollution and those that do not. I've been accused by my friends of having a pretty apocalyptic view of the future, and probably rightly so. It's hard not to spend most of your time at university reading about human rights and migration issues and not come out feeling a little disheartened. I'm pessimistic by nature, so when I'm confronted with issues like the refugee crisis, climate change, and mass migration, it's sometimes easier to develop a level of apathy about the whole thing and just switch off. But I think this is dangerous. It's all too easy when confronted with crises like the European refugee crisis to lose sight of the individuality of refugees and the specific experiences of suffering, separation, and dislocation. Now, back in episode 1, I said that I wanted to find tangible solutions to the issues addressed in this podcast, and then I paused, acknowledging how silly that sounded. These are big issues, things that even the United Nations and individual states continue to struggle with. So, here is my 2 cents on what I think you and I, the little guys in a big world of power players, businessmen, and politicians, can do to address some of the issues brought up in this podcast. First, you can become better informed, which you've already started to do by listening to this podcast's 8 episodes. Unless, of course, you just skip to the end, in which case, hi, I'd love for you to check out the other 7 episodes. If you're a voting member of a democracy, I can't express to you how much your vote actually matters. What issues and policies make it to the debate floor depend so much on how you vote and who you vote for. But it's really hard to vote effectively when you don't know what issues you think need to be addressed and which candidates will actually get behind those issues. There is this video on InfoWars that's a good example of what happens when voters are ill-informed about their candidates and their policies. The question posed was, who do you want to be the US president and why? Just listen to these responses.
Who are you going to be voting for in November, sir?
Actually, I'm voting for Donald Trump.
Why do you like Trump?
Because he's going to do some change, dude.
Not Hillary.
What do you think about Trump?
As long as he's not Hillary.
Why don't you like Hillary?
Liar.
Donald Trump, man.
Yes.
Just from the videos of her falling out or, the weird switching thing. Yeah, of course, we all saw that.
Now, I truly don't mind who you vote for, but please, from the bottom of my heart, have a better answer for voting for a candidate than not Hillary because of the twitchy thing. Next, you can donate. Now, I know this can feel impersonal, but I truly believe you can make an impact by donating to whatever organisation you deem as providing a service that improves society as a whole. A couple of good ones to start off with are UNHCR, Refugees International, and World Relief. And finally, I want us to remember that there is always hope. I know this podcast was a bit of a downer in some ways, so I want to end this series with a final anecdote. I was wandering the streets of Barcelona on World Refugee Day, and I ran into a group of people who had set up rows of canvases outside of town hall, and who were proceeding to paint in what was at least 30-degree weather. I learned that they were from an organisation called Drawing for Smiles, and I had a chance to talk to one of their members.
Okay, so today it's the International Day for the Refugees. We organized 18 drawings, like a comic book, a sequence of 18 drawings, and we're going to paint it live.
And then he said something that stayed with me.
The city of Barcelona is open to the refugees, and today is the day to say welcome, because here we want them to. And we know about the situation, and we're here to say welcome. Yeah.
Each week, I've presented a much shorter version of the credits, but this time I want to sit down and truly thank the people who have helped so much with this podcast. Thank you to the Robertson Scholarship Program for providing funding for my summer research. Thanks to Sarah Pollock for not only providing motions graphics, but for also providing an endless amount of support. Thank you to all of those who agreed to take the time out of their busy schedules to be interviewed by an inexperienced college student. And finally, thank you to my family. You can find a full transcript of this podcast, along with a bibliography and links to reference articles on Motion's website. Motion's music is produced by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you to Sarah Pollock for designing Motion's graphics.